It starts so quietly that you almost miss it happening. You stop posting. You leave the group chat on mute for days that stretch into weeks. Someone invites you somewhere, and the thought of getting ready, showing up, being perceived by a room full of people makes your chest tighten in a way it never used to. You're not angry at anyone. You're not depressed in the way people assume. Something deeper has shifted. The part of you that once craved being noticed, being included, being seen by others has gone completely dark. And you can't explain it because you don't fully understand it yourself. Carl Jung studied this phenomenon extensively, and what he found unsettled him. Because the psychiatric establishment of his era interpreted withdrawal as pathology. If someone stopped wanting social contact, stopped performing for others, stopped seeking visibility, the diagnosis was depression, avoidance, or antisocial tendency. But Jung saw something his colleagues refused to see. He observed that certain people weren't retreating from life. They were retreating from a version of life that had been slowly killing them. And the withdrawal that looked like dysfunction from the outside was actually the psyche initiating one of the most important transformations a human being can undergo. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about people who no longer want to be seen. Why this withdrawal is radically different from what it appears, what's actually dying inside you when the desire for visibility disappears. And why this process, as disorienting as it feels, may be the most honest thing your psychology has ever done. To understand what's happening when someone stops wanting to be seen, you first have to understand what being seen actually meant to them. Jung spent decades studying what he called the persona, the mask a person constructs and wears for the world. This isn't a metaphor. It's a psychological structure. From the time you're a small child, you learn which version of yourself gets love, approval, safety, and belonging. You learn which emotions are acceptable and which ones get you punished. You learn which parts of your personality make people stay and which parts make them leave. And slowly, unconsciously, you build a mask that shows the world only what it wants to see. For most people, this mask becomes so familiar that they forget it's a mask at all. They think the persona is who they are, the charming version, the helpful version, the funny, agreeable, always available version. They've worn it so long that removing it feels like removing skin. And their entire social world is built around that mask. People don't love them. People love the performance. But the person inside the performance doesn't know that yet. They just know that when they show up as the mask, they get rewarded. And when they slip, when the real self leaks through, the response is confusion or rejection. Jung found that the desire to be seen is almost never a desire to be seen as you actually are. It's a desire to have the persona validated. You want people to look at you and confirm that the mask is working, that you're pulling it off, that the version of you that you've constructed is believable and lovable. Every social interaction becomes a performance review. Every like, every compliment, every invitation is evidence that the mask is holding, and that evidence feels like love, but it isn't. It's applause. And there's a devastating difference between being applauded and being known. This is why the disappearance happens, because at some point, the person behind the mask starts to suffocate. The gap between who they're performing and who they actually are becomes so wide that maintaining the performance requires more energy than they have. They're exhausted not from life, but from the labor of being perceived. Every social event requires them to activate the persona, suppress the real self, manage everyone's experience of them, and then come home and collapse from the effort of pretending to be someone they're not. Jung described this as persona fatigue, the psychological exhaustion that occurs when someone has been maintaining a false front for so long that their psyche begins to rebel. The rebellion doesn't look dramatic. It looks like canceling plans, like not returning calls, like losing interest in social media, like finding excuses to stay home, like slowly, quietly removing yourself from every situation where you'd be required to perform. And here's what Jung found that changes everything about how we understand this withdrawal. The people experiencing it almost always interpret it as something wrong with them. They think they're becoming antisocial. They worry they're depressed. They feel guilty for not wanting to see people. They force themselves to show up and then feel worse because the performance feels more hollow than ever. They don't realize that what's happening isn't breakdown. It's their psyche trying to save their life by dismantling a false self that was never sustainable. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process through which a person stops identifying with their mask and begins the terrifying work of discovering who they actually are underneath it. But here's why it feels so disorienting. When you've spent your entire life being seen as the persona, losing the desire to be seen feels like losing yourself, because the persona was the only self you knew. Without the mask, without the performance, without the audience, you don't know who you are. And that emptiness is frightening in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The people around you don't help. They notice the withdrawal, and they react with concern that's really discomfort. They want the old you back, the fun one, the available one, the one who showed up and made everyone feel good. They say things like, "You've changed and I'm worried about you, and you used to be so social." And what they mean is that your performance was convenient for them, and your authenticity is inconvenient. They don't want you to be real. They want you to be recognizable. And the pressure to resume the performance can be enormous because it comes disguised as love. Jung was particularly interested in this dynamic. He found that when someone begins to withdraw their persona, the social system pushes back hard. Friends get offended. Family members get anxious. Partners feel rejected. Because everyone in the person's life has a relationship with the mask, not with the human being wearing it. And when the mask starts coming off, those relationships are exposed for what they actually were. Agreements between performances, contracts between personas, connections that required both parties to remain partially false. This is one of the most painful revelations of the withdrawal process. You start to see that many of your relationships can't survive your authenticity. That people you thought loved you actually loved what you did for them, how you made them feel, the role you played in their psychological ecosystem. And when you stop playing that role, they don't fight for the relationship. They fight for the role. They don't miss you. They miss the function you served. Realizing this doesn't make you bitter. It makes you grieve, because you're losing people you cared about. And the loss is made worse by the recognition that what you thought you had with them was never quite real. But Jung found that this grief, as devastating as it is, serves a critical psychological function. It strips away the final illusion that the persona was keeping you safe. Because the persona's promise was always this: perform correctly and you'll be loved. Be who they want and you'll belong. Maintain the mask and you'll never be alone. And for years, maybe decades, you believed that promise. You performed and you were rewarded. But now you're seeing that the reward was conditional, that the belonging required your absence, that the love was directed at a fiction, and that recognition, painful as it is what finally sets you free from the compulsion to perform. This is where Jung's framework becomes essential for understanding what happens next. Because once the desire to be seen dissolves, something unexpected begins. The person doesn't become empty, they become quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time in their life, they can hear themselves. Not the persona's voice telling them what to say and how to act and who to be. Their actual voice, the one that's been buried under decades of performance. The one that knows what they actually feel, what they actually want, what they actually need, independent of anyone else's expectations. If this process resonates with something you're living through right now, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you reconnect with the self that lives beneath the performance. It might be exactly what this phase of your journey is asking for. You'll find the link below. Jung described this phase as hearing the self for the first time, and he was careful to distinguish the self from the ego. The ego is the I you think you are, the constructed identity, the persona, plus whatever conscious self-concept you've assembled. The self, in Jung's framework, is something much larger. It's the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious, the organizing intelligence that knows who you're supposed to become, even when you don't. And for most of your life, the persona's noise has been so loud that the self's voice couldn't reach you. The withdrawal creates the silence that makes hearing possible. This is why people in this phase often feel drawn to solitude in a way that alarms everyone around them. They're not isolating because they're broken. They're creating the conditions necessary for the most important conversation of their life. The conversation with themselves, the real one. Not the curated version they present in therapy or journaling or social media posts about growth. The raw, unfiltered encounter with who they actually are when no one is watching and no performance is required. Jung warned that this encounter is not peaceful. When the persona drops and you meet yourself without the mask, you don't find some serene, enlightened being. You find everything you've been hiding. The rage you weren't allowed to express, the grief you never processed, the needs you learned to suppress, the parts of yourself you decided were unacceptable and locked away so thoroughly that you forgot they existed. Jung called this the shadow, and meeting it is the unavoidable price of dropping the mask. This is where many people panic and try to rebuild the persona. The shadow feels too dark, too overwhelming, too contradictory to the person they thought they were. They'd rather go back to performing than face what's underneath, and some do. They force themselves back into social circulation, reactivate the mask, resume the performance. And the world welcomes them back because the world prefers comfortable fictions to uncomfortable truths. But the people who stay in the withdrawal, who tolerate the discomfort of meeting their own shadow, experience something Jung considered one of the most significant psychological events possible: integration. They begin to incorporate the rejected parts of themselves into their conscious identity. The anger becomes accessible assertiveness instead of suppressed rage. The grief moves through instead of staying frozen. The needs become speakable instead of shameful. The shadow doesn't disappear. It becomes part of a larger, more complete self. And here's what Jung found most remarkable about people who completed this process. They did eventually return to social life, but they returned as fundamentally different people. They no longer needed to be seen. They were willing to be seen. And there's an enormous psychological difference between those two states. Needing to be seen means your sense of self depends on external validation. Willing to be seen means your sense of self is established internally and you can share it with others without requiring their approval to feel real. People who have gone through this transformation have a quality that's difficult to describe but immediately recognizable. They're present without performing. They're warm without being desperate to please. They can be in a room full of people without managing everyone's perception of them. They speak honestly because they're no longer terrified that honesty will cost them belonging. They've discovered that belonging based on performance isn't belonging at all. And they'd rather be genuinely seen by 3 people than applauded by 300. Jung observed that these individuals often had smaller social circles after the transformation, but dramatically deeper connections. Because they'd lost the ability to maintain relationships that required performance. They couldn't do it anymore. The mask had been dismantled too thoroughly to reassemble. So the people who remained in their lives were the ones who could tolerate, even welcome, the unmasked version, the real one, the complicated, imperfect, shadow-integrated, fully human one. This is what the outside world doesn't understand about people who no longer want to be seen. It's not that they've given up on connection. It's that they've given up on the kind of connection that requires them to disappear in order to be included. They've stopped being willing to erase themselves for the comfort of others. They've recognized that the visibility they once craved was actually a prison, a constant performance review where the price of admission was self-abandonment. Jung also discovered something about this withdrawal that carries an uncomfortable truth. The desire to be seen often masks the terror of being known. Being seen is controllable. You curate what's visible. You manage the angles. You present the highlight reel. Being known is uncontrollable. It means someone perceives you accurately, including the parts you'd prefer to hide. And for people whose survival depended on maintaining a careful performance, being known feels genuinely dangerous. So the withdrawal isn't just from social performance. It's from the exhausting vigilance required to ensure no one sees too deeply, to make sure the mask never slips, to guarantee that the shadow stays hidden. When that vigilance becomes unbearable, the person doesn't just step back from socializing. They step back from the entire system of self-surveillance that's been running since childhood. They stop monitoring how they're perceived. They stop adjusting their behavior to manage others' reactions. They stop performing acceptability. And the relief of dropping that vigilance is so profound that they have no interest in picking it back up. If you're in this phase right now, here's what Jung would want you to understand. You're not broken. You're not becoming antisocial or avoidant or cold. You're in the middle of a psychological transformation that most people never have the courage to undergo. The desire to disappear is your psyche's way of creating space for you to exist as yourself, possibly for the first time. The loneliness you feel isn't the loneliness of rejection. It's the loneliness of becoming real in a world that rewards performance. Jung would also tell you that this phase has a natural duration. It doesn't last forever, even though it feels like it will. The withdrawal creates the conditions for integration. The integration creates a new, more authentic self. And that self will eventually want connection again. But it will want genuine connection, the kind where you show up as you are, not as you think you need to be. The kind where being seen doesn't require a performance. The kind where you're known, not just visible. The world will tell you to push through it, to force yourself out, to fake it until you make it, to put on the mask one more time because that's what functional adults do. Jung would tell you the opposite. He'd tell you to let the withdrawal do its work, to stop fighting the silence and start listening to what it's trying to teach you, to let the persona die the death it needs to die so that something truer can emerge from underneath it. This isn't comfortable advice. It doesn't feel productive. It doesn't give you 5 steps to get back to normal, because Jung understood that getting back to normal is exactly what your psyche is trying to protect you from. Normal was the performance. Normal was the mask. Normal was the slow erasure of yourself in exchange for approval that never actually nourished you. Your psyche isn't trying to get you back to normal. It's trying to get you somewhere you've never been, somewhere real. The people who no longer want to be seen are not disappearing. They're arriving for the first time, without the costume, without the script, without the desperate need for an audience to confirm they exist. They exist. They know it now. Not because someone saw them and reflected it back, but because they finally stopped performing long enough to feel themselves from the inside. That's not pathology. That's not avoidance. That's the beginning of what Jung called the authentic life, the one that starts only when the performance ends. And if you're standing in that silence right now, wondering if something is wrong with you because the world feels too loud and the mask feels too heavy and the thought of being perceived makes you want to retreat even further, nothing is wrong. Everything is finally becoming right. You just can't see it yet because you're inside the transformation. But one day, you'll look back at this quiet, disorienting, lonely phase and recognize it as the moment you stopped performing your life and started actually living it. If you haven't yet, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this threshold. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings to help you meet the self that's emerging now that the mask is coming off. You'll find it linked below.